Okay. You want me to call you? Okay. Oh, Good morning, Facebook family. Welcome to Sunday School. I'm so glad that you could join us again for First Baptist Church Sunday School. We are First Baptist, 210 Garment Street, Warner Robins, Georgia, 31088. I certainly thank the media team for getting us up and running another Sunday morning. One of the things that I did want to foot stomp before we got started is the fact that we have an actual lineup, First Baptist Church lineup. As you can see on the slide, we've got prayer time beginning at 6 o'clock with Pastor Curvin, and that's a prayer call-in line. Right now, this is the Sunday School, and we're Facebook Live. At 10 o'clock, a minister will come back and give us a Sunday service. And then coming next week, I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that we're going to have something for the kids, something for the youth, something for the young people, because in this trying times, we all need to rely and hear a word from God. So coming next Sunday, beginning at 11 o'clock, we're going to have the K4 and K5, the youth service, and then at 11:30, we're going to have grades 1 through 5, and then lastly, at the noon hour, we're going to have something for the grades 6 through 12, and we're calling that our youth service, and you'll be able to find that on Zoom. There'll be more coming out on that, so just stay apprised of what's happening on the Facebook and the other social media we have out there. This morning's lesson is titled, on the next slide, is titled, Injustice Will Be Punished. Injustice will be punished. Notice that the lesson doesn't say that injustice might be punished, and notice that it doesn't say that he will think about punishment, but that it will be punished. This morning's lesson comes out of the book of Esther. The book of Esther. Esther is an Old Testament history book, and this story takes place in the time of the Medo-Persian Empire exile. What had actually happened is the children of Israel had been invaded by another group called the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, and he took them into exile, and then the Medo-Persian Empire took over for the Babylonians, and then they carried them to Shushan, the palace. If you've ever read the story of Nehemiah, the books that precedes this particular book called Esther, you'll notice that Nehemiah is also in that same palace that we find Esther this morning. So just tell all your friends, tell all your neighbors, and if there's a Mordecai in your life, even tell him too. So if you got enemies, tell them that we're Facebook Live. One of the things that we're going to be talking about this morning when we talk about Esther is our feast, and you'll find that on the slide in front of you. They talk about, if you study the history of Israel, you know that they have 6 feasts. They have 3 great feasts, and they all consist of events that happened when Moses was in charge of the children of Israel. That being the Passover, you may recall that there were 10 plagues, or at least that's how the Egyptians saw them. The Israelites probably saw them as miracles. And then 50 days later, after they left Egypt, there was Pentecost. That's where they got the 10 Commandments on the backside of Mount Sinai. And then Tabernacles. God provided for the children of Israel some 40 years as they walked through the wilderness, just as he's providing for us today, even in the midst of this pandemic. And what they did is to shade themselves from the hot sun. They would build these lulabs, L-U-L-A-B or L-U-L-A-V, and they were comprised of mainly palm leaves, and that would protect them from the burning sun in the day, and so they would commemorate that. The one thing about the 3 great feasts is they were all celebrated in the city of Jerusalem. So all the Jews were basically required to come back and celebrate and basically sacrifice there at the temple in Jerusalem. But today I want to talk to you about one of the 3 lesser feasts. We've got trumpets. That's basically the New Year where they celebrate it, and then there was dedication. And that basically talks about the fact that what they were celebrating for dedication was that the temple had been dedicated after it had been desecrated by the Syrians. And this morning, Purim, Purim, and the word is derived from the Hebrew word pur, P-U-R, and it simply means to draw lots. It's akin to drawing straws. It's basically the same thing that they did when they threw Jonah overboard. They drew lots to see who the problem child was. And so what Mordecai did when he decided to exterminate the Jews out of the Medo-Persian Empire, 127 provinces, is he drew lots to figure out what day that would be. And we'll get into more detail on that as we go through. And lastly, before we get started, I want us to look at the main characters. You'll find that up on the slide now. You've got King Xerxes. He's also known as Artaxerxes II, or Ahasuerus if you're reading King James, but it's all the same person. And then he was originally married to Vashti, the queen, but eventually she became deposed. And then the queen that replaced her was Esther. Esther also has a second name, and her Hebrew name is Hadassah, and she became the new queen. And then for every good Bible story, you got to have an antagonist, and that would be Mordecai. That would be Haman. I'm sorry, he's the enemy of the Jews. And then you got Mordecai, who's Esther's uncle / cousin / father, and we'll get into that in a little more as we go through the particulars of the 7th chapter. But before we do that, let's just let us lead into that 7th chapter. Obviously, there were 6 chapters before that, and so one of the things I want us to do is just look at the background, starting with chapter 1. The Bible tells us that in the 3rd year of King Ahasuerus' reign, or Xerxes, or Artaxerxes II, the king threw this huge party. And when I say it was a huge party, I mean a huge party. The 1st chapter tells us that the bigwigs from all 127 provinces that he ruled were there. And the party for the rich folk lasted 180 days. Can you imagine partying for 6 months straight? And just for good measure, when you thought he would have wound up at 180, he stuck another 7 more days just because he could. And that's when the trouble started. Memo to all you big ballers and shot callers. If you're going to throw a huge, large, super giant, best as ever party, don't do it over 180 days. That's enough. Because let me tell you what happened. The last week, on the very last day, what he did is he threw a party for everybody in the palace, everybody who was inside the fortress, rich or old, rich or poor, young or old. He just threw a big party. The drinks were flowing, the Bible said. The fellows were partying separately from the women. And they got to feeling real nice. I mean real nice. And you know what happens when a bunch of fellas get to partying? They start talking. And they probably started off with something like sports. And one of them probably said that my supercharged chariot, the LS3 that I've got in it, it's faster than any Coyote that Ford ever put out. It's faster than any Stroker Hemi that Dodge ever put out. And then they probably kept drinking and they kept talking. And then the conversation went to who had the most money. You fellas know exactly what I'm talking about. Somebody who probably sounded a lot like my granddaddy, Henry Ford, said that he had enough money to burn up a wet mule. I never did quite figure out what that meant. And I was listening to the last time Reverend Jeremiah Wright came here. He talked about his grandmother. When he talked about Job, he said that Job had so much money that his grandmama would say that he had money's mammy. So that's a lot of money. And you know what the conversation was going to eventually turn to, right, fellas? Shopping. Just kidding. They started talking about women. And then undoubtedly somebody said that my woman is so fine that I drink her bath water. And that probably elicited a number of oohs and ahs from the brothers. And then somebody probably came behind him and said, my woman is so fine, I'll crawl through 3 miles on my hands and knees through broken glass and nails just to see her. And then the party host, King Xerxes, stood up and said, what are y'all talking about? I'm going to get my wife to come over here right now with a crown and not much else on and show all of you what fine is. So the guests waited, and they waited, and they waited. Still, no Queen Vashti. Fellas probably started wondering, how long does it take to put a tiara on? And finally, one of the eunuchs slipped the king a note from Queen Vashti that read, and I'm paraphrasing, is you crazy? In other words, she was letting him know, I'm not coming over there half-dressed with a whole bunch of drunk men just to show off for you. And I want to tell you, if there's any doubt as to why you should cut the party off at 180 days, let's read verses 16 through 20 in the NLT. It says it like this. One of the people that he relied on for advice was named Memucan. And Memucan, there were 7 of them, but it says that Memucan answered the king and his nobles, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husband when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. And all the men are probably nodding their head this way. And all the women are doing like this and rolling their eyes. And then Memucan goes on, he says, before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. The men are still going like this. And then Memucan made a proposal. He said, so if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. Let me repeat that. It cannot be revoked. And he goes on to say it should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, I can see you shaking your head, brothers, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. If we didn't go any further in the book this morning, most of us can figure out this is not going to end well for somebody. This is not going to end well for somebody. Chapter 2, Queen Vashti has been gone for 4 long years after an exhaustive search for her replacement, Esther, as crowned queen. Things are going really well for the Jews. Mordecai, her uncle, cousin, daddy, gets a job working for the king. One day he overhears a plot to kill the king. He reports it and becomes the forgotten hero. And then as we go to chapter 3, Haman gets a big promotion. That's the enemy of the Jews. He becomes the number 2 man in all of the Medo-Persian kingdom. Even at that, Mordecai, Esther's uncle / daddy / cousin, won't bow down to him. Haman then plots to kill the Jews, all the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the Medo-Persian Empire. The Hebrew word for pure is drawing lots, and that's where we get this word that we're studying about today. And then on top of that, Haman promises the king a boatload of money to be able to kill all the Jews. Chapter 4, Mordecai tells Esther she needs him to come through for her uncle / cousin / daddy. Esther tells the Jews to fast and pray for 72 hours. And she and all her mates will do the same. And she realizes that this is a matter of life and death. And but she says she's going to attempt to talk to the king. And the key verse in this whole book is probably 14:4, where Mordecai reminds Esther of just who she is and how she's not going to be able to get away from the fact that she's a Jew. He says that who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. And I'm reminded at the time we're in, at the time of this coronavirus, that we as children of God, of color, have been made for this. The people who study such things estimate the number of African Americans who were going through the Middle Passage who didn't make it at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is somewhere between 4 and 10 million people. Just think about all of our ancestors who never made it to these shores of the United States of America. And that lets us know that we're made out of some good stuff. And that's what Haman reminds Esther, is that Mordecai reminds Esther that you're made out of good stuff. I was telling Deacon Hagerbrook the other day, I said, Deke, a lot of good is going to come out of this virus. And I think this church, First Baptist, is made for this. It's just made for this. And so I think when we come through this, we're going to be better for it, having gone through it. And we're designed for it. So have no doubt, brothers and sisters, that we will come out and we will be victorious. Chapter 5, Esther dresses up for the king before she goes in. And rather than it being difficult, the king is like putty in her hands. Rather than just tell the king her request, what Esther does is she invites him and Haman to a dinner party. Haman leaves the first part and he's feeling good. They've been doing a little drinking, and he's been invited to a second party. The only thing that ruined his day is when he was on his way home, he saw Mordecai. And he couldn't stand that. So when he gets home, he starts to tell his wife and friends about all the children he got, all the money he has. He's just bragging and bragging. But he has a but in his conversation, and the but is this. He said, but that Mordecai, I got to do something about it. And being who she was and who his friends were, that they convinced him to build gallows to hang Mordecai on and go tell the king that that's what he was planning to do. And so Haman said to himself, that's a pretty good idea. I don't have to wait until next year to exterminate Mordecai. I'm going to get that done right now. And then by the time we get to chapter 6, King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, that night, he can't sleep. He's probably wondering, the Bible doesn't say this, but I would imagine he's wondering why Esther won't tell him what's bothering her. And I'm sure the thought crossed his mind that something might be up between Esther and Haman. The late Bill Weathers says he keeps adding 1 and 1, and he keeps coming up with a sum of 3. I think that's where King Xerxes is right now. He keeps saying, wait a minute. Haman was invited to the last party, and now he's coming to this party, and he was starting to wonder, what's up with Queen Esther keep inviting a third wheel? And then, because he can't sleep, the king tells one of his servants to bring the book about the time that somebody who tried to kill him. And after hearing the recount of that story, he realized that Mordecai, the one who literally saved his life, had never been properly rewarded. And that brings us to the 7th chapter, basically. But before that, in the 6th chapter, as it turned out, Haman was in the courtyard. The king invites him in, and he gets Haman to offer some suggestions about how he should honor a hero. Thinking the king is talking about him, Haman is full of himself. So he said that the king, the first thing he should do is pull out all stops. dress up the horse, give the man that you want to honor one of your robes. Have somebody of importance parade him through the streets and says, this is what the king does for the man that he wants to honor. And the king says, those are really good ideas. What I want you to do is put all of that into action. I want you to go get Mordecai, dress him up, and do everything you just suggested. Let me stop right here and put a plug in for reading your Bible. I want to tell you this morning, if nobody's ever told you this before, the Bible is better than Harlequin romance. It's better than True Detective. It's better than True Romance. It's better than anything that Joan Collins ever wrote, anything that Larry McMurtry ever wrote, anything that Stephen King ever wrote. The Bible is better than Dear Abby. It's better than the Hardy Boys. It's better than John Wayne. In fact, the Bible is even better than Sanford and Son. And I haven't even gotten to the lesson. So by the time we get to chapter 7, that's where we pick up this morning's lesson. If you've got your Bible in the King James, it reads, and it should be up on the slide, it says, so the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. So there they are again, the three of them. That third wheel is there yet again. And the king is really starting to wonder what's up with that. And verse 2 says, and the king said again unto Esther, on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? In other words, what is it that you have that you want me to do that's so pressing on your mind? And then he goes on and says, it shall be granted thee. And just to let you know how serious it is, he says, and that what is thy request, it shall be performed even to half of the kingdom. And one of the things that we should note this morning, things haven't changed all that much. If you go to court, brothers, expect to give up at least half. And so we find out how well the king loved Esther. Without even the judge telling him to do so, he said that up to half. And that was the same thing that Herod told Herodias, his daughter, after she danced for them in the New Testament. And that was the setup. And so here we go. The king is now on the hook. Then Esther, in verse number 3 says, the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me, petition, and my people at my request. And the king is probably wondering, girl, what you talking about? So she goes on in verse 4, she says, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to be perished. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. What Esther is basically saying, it wouldn't be so bad if we were just being enslaved. She probably stops and says, the fact of the matter, if that's all it was, I would even bother you with this. She says, let me give you a little history lesson this morning, King. She says that my people were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. She says, if you would just go one book back to the book of Nehemiah, you'll see that Nehemiah, one of my distant relatives, were actually the cupbearer to your father, Artaxerxes I. So he's saying, we don't have any problems necessarily with being enslaved, and I wouldn't even bother you. And she says, shoot, before we came to Medo-Persia, we were slaves in Babylonia. And so that's not our issue. And she says, no, this is a whole different deal that's going on that I'm bringing before you, Royal Highness. She says, this is beyond wickedness. She says that this is diabolical. This is wickedness on anabolic steroids. This is straight out of the pit of hell. And then she really has the king's attention. And verse 5 tells us that then the king, Ahasuerus, answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? In other words, just point him out. Just wink. Just nod. Just kind of lean that way. I just want to know who this rascal is. And he goes on and says, not only do I want to know who he is, then I want to know where he is. That durst presume in his heart to do so. Talking about getting rid of my baby Esther. What's up with that? I can't wait to lay hands on that. I mean, the king is mortified. You probably could have just pushed him over with a feather. He was not expecting to hear something like this at all. He was thinking maybe the girl just wanted another chariot, another tiara, maybe 2 more evening dresses, another gown, somebody else to wait on her. But no, he finds out just how serious this case is. Verse 6 tells us, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And right then, you could almost see it. We haven't seen it in the first 6 chapters, but this king Ahasuerus, this king Xerxes, this king Artaxerxes II, after 7 chapters, he finally starts to get a clue. He finally has a thought of his own. How novel. He is just, what is this new thing? And verse 7, and the king arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request of his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. He's like, I guess I've had it coming. And verse 8 says, then the king returned out of the palace garden and to the place of the banquet of wine. And that's where he finds Haman was fallen upon the bed where Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? In other words, if this were a television drama, this would be the crescendo part. This would be the part in the movie theaters where the brothers were getting ready to say, uh-oh. This is the uh-oh moment in the drama. And then it says, as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then the king, just to paraphrase, said, it wasn't bad enough that you made me pass a law to kill Esther and all her kin folks. He says, no, that wasn't bad enough. He says, now I come back, find you trying to push up on my woman while I'm outside trying on this new thinking thing for myself, and I find you trying to do something like this even in my own house. He's like, no. This is not going to go down like this. I told you early in the story that it wasn't going to end well for somebody. Verses 9 and 10 basically says this, and Habanah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, also the gallows 50 feet high, 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet high, which Haman has made for Mordecai, who spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman, verse 10 tells us, on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. In other words, that was the only thing that would satisfy the king after he found out what was really going on. And that was the conclusion of chapter 7. But I'm here to tell you that the story does not end there. There are 3 more chapters. And what those 3 chapters pretty much do is they put a fine point on the old saying that I heard for a long time. I used to hear the old deacon say, if you dig one ditch, you better dig 2. Because the first you dig just might be for you. But after reading the lesson this morning, I like to give you the updated version of that saying. And it goes something like this. If you dig one ditch, You better dig 75,811. Let me break it down to you. That's 75,000 throughout the 127 provinces. That's how many of the Jewish enemies were destroyed in those 2 days. And then back at the palace at the fortress of Shushan, 800 enemies of the Jews were destroyed. And lastly, you better dig 10 more for Haman's 10 sons. And of course, 1 for Haman, the enemy of the Jews. That brings us to a grand total of 75,811. And that is the new math, according to the book of Esther. Be blessed, my brothers, my sisters, my Facebook friends. My name is Gary Foy. I'll see you next week at 8 a.m. And before we go, I just want to remind you of what's coming up and what we have in store for everyone for the day of Sunday. Thank you.